What I'm seeing a lot now, and Tubi's a part of this, is the micro-budget, features where people are making films, for 25,000 and less, that are doing well on Tubi.
Where are the largest revenues right now coming from for filmmakers?
Yeah, I think, streamers are still kind of the #1 place for revenue, whether it's the subscription video on demand companies like Netflix, Amazon, Apple, Peacock, Paramount Plus, all the big streamers are, essentially that first pay window that's the most lucrative window. If you can get those deals now, that's where the biggest revenue is coming from.
Will filmmakers make more money on Netflix or Tubi?
I think most of them will make more money on Netflix because it's the license fees are usually pretty strong, but there are some niche films on Tubi that are probably doing more than they would do on Netflix, but they're films that Netflix would probably never license to begin with. So Tubi is an interesting model. They have a really great track record for certain types of films, and I think that they're really, I think independent filmmakers are fortunate to have them right now because you can still, get your film on Tubi, even on a rev share basis, and generate revenue. And if it does well, you can do quite well. And if it does okay, at least you're seeing something back from your investment.
And Tubi has a lot of larger titles on there too, so it pulls in sort of the general audience, and then you might be suggested something that's more art house and.
Yeah, I think, they have such a large audience that there's really, something for everyone in terms of almost any type of film. There's going to be an audience for it on Tubi somewhere. So, as long as out of 100 million people, you have something that, a decent chunk want to watch, you can do really well in terms of revenue on there.
If you had to rate these platforms based on payouts, how would you rate them?
Well, from what I've seen lately, like the SVODs are still the kings. If you can get good license fees, typically Netflix and Amazon and Apple are going to pay the most in terms of license fees. And then after that, the AVOD platforms like Tubi and Amazon's Freevee and Pluto, typically they're going to be a rev share deal unless they make it an original. The payout Tubi is usually the top, kind of top dog on the AVOD side in terms of the revenue, and they're doing probably almost 10x probably of the next platform from, the numbers that I've seen. So they still have, this massive audience. They're still paying, the producers based on views, and they seem to be the kind of breakout platform for indie films for now, and, hopefully that continues.
How about YouTube?
Yeah, YouTube is interesting. It's come on, strong the last few years. I think the interesting thing about YouTube is if you just place your film on YouTube without much, name value or anything to draw, it's probably not going to do very well. But there are more kind of movie-oriented YouTube channels that have, amassed an audience that goes there to watch movies. And so if you, can get on those platforms, the channels on YouTube, it becomes another, very large audience AVOD platform. So you can do well, and I think that's going to continue to grow. I think the trend is, YouTube's going to probably keep growing and probably eventually surpass, Tubi just because they have such a massive audience worldwide.
How important are AVOD or FAST platforms for independent filmmakers right now?
I think they're really important right now. AVOD has been, picking up a lot of the slack in terms of the slowdown of the SVODs, the Netflixes and, the Amazons picking up less independent films. I think, the AVOD has been a place where you can find an audience and, still generate revenue and do well. So it's been extremely important, and it's been one of the few kind of bright spots in terms of growth over the last few years. I think it's at some point it's going to get to a saturation point, but right now it still seems to be growing, and I'm really grateful there's that outlet for a lot of films that just have no other way to reach an audience.
Besides Tubi, are there any other emerging platforms any independent filmmakers should know about?
Yeah, I would say Mubi is giving me hope because they seem to be filling in a little space, for discovery. They still seem to be open to discovering new films, independent films that will be on the festival circuit. They're less dependent on names. They're looking for, take a big art house film that's, a creative, challenge to other distributors. So I like, what they're doing in the space. In terms of platforms, they're, probably my biggest hope in terms of, kind of picking up the slack of other platforms that have maybe moved away from the smaller indie films. So I'm hoping that continues. In terms of other platforms from there, I mean, I think, YouTube is interesting because I think, the niche channels on YouTube are going to keep growing. Movie channels, I look specifically documentary channels and different things that will continue to build audience, and that way you can reach those people easily and inexpensively. So your film can go out, and if you're on one of these channels, it'll get served to the right audience, so that they'll be able to see it and you'll be able to monetize, their viewing with ads.
When filmmakers come to you, what's their wish list for where they want their movies?
I think most people still, look at Netflix as the top, spot they want to see their film. I think just because they realize if it's there, everyone will have access to it. Everyone will be able to see it. They'll typically being paid well to be on there. So that's usually where, most people want to end up. Like it's at the top of everyone's kind of wish list. But, other platforms are growing quickly, and, they can pay, competitively as well. And, Amazon and Apple, I think Apple's, made a name for themselves as being very prestigious with a lot of the films that they pick up, and, very high quality. So, those are always at the top of the list as well. I think, it depends on the filmmaker. They might have something very specific. If they have a niche film, they might have a more niche kind of distributor or platform that they're aiming for. But for most people, I think, it's always still Netflix.
And Apple, is their rev share the same for every person? It's like 70-30 or?
Well, the Apple, you have iTunes, and that's where you typically would see the rev share. And so, on Apple Plus, which is their SVOD service, then you're talking about license fees, and I'm not aware that they're doing rev share on that. They're very selective in terms of what they pick up and, what they take. But if you can get a deal there on the Apple Plus side, it can be very lucrative and, a great platform.
Do you know what the breakdown is for Tubi, or it's just dependent on how many times the movie's been seen?
Yeah, I mean, it's a calculation based on how many ads they watch. So if they watch the whole film, and I think they're every 5 or 7 minutes they cut in and show ads. So the longer someone watches it, the more ads they watch, and the more you get paid. And I think if they watch the whole film, I mean, the numbers that I hear, 15 cents. If somebody watches all the ads that they're shown, could go back to the filmmaker. So, but they're constantly adjusting it and changing the formula a little bit. So I'd have to see what the current numbers look like.
Which platforms are you recommending the most right now?
Well, I really like Tubi. I think Tubi's great because they still are pretty accessible to most independent films. And I think the combination of Tubi along with some of the transactional video on demand platforms like iTunes and Amazon transactional, that's where you can buy or rent a movie, is a good combination for people who don't want to sit through ads. So, if you have a film and it's on Tubi, like some people just would rather pay $4.99 and rent it and not watch ads, or pay $10 and own it rather than watch ads. So I think it's a good combination. You kind of cover a huge amount of the audience if you're on those, just those two platforms. Hopefully once you get to those platforms, you can add to it by going, non-exclusively to other platforms. So, if you're on the AVOD platforms, hopefully you're also on Amazon Freevee and Pluto and YouTube and, all the transactional video on demand platforms as well. So, once you get out there, you might not be making huge money on any one platform, but hopefully as an aggregate, you're doing money on all of the other platforms every quarter, so that you're seeing a decent return every quarter.
And then as we make a sort of a return to physical media, and it's now trendy to go to video stores, which once seemed like an inconvenience to maybe someone my age, do people talk about that, or no, it's not really entered the conversation?
It's a small part. It's definitely, there are fans of it, and DVD and Blu-ray. And, one of the interesting things that's kind of come about on that side, on the physical things, is the problem with DVD is that it was waning, is that you'd have too much inventory. So, companies would go and make 20,000 DVD copies and ship them to the stores, and they didn't sell through, and they get back a big chunk in returns. Well, now a lot of companies are moving to, print on demand, basically, DVDs and Blu-rays, so they don't make it until it's ordered. So if somebody orders a Blu-ray, it presses it right there, sends them off a new Blu-ray. But if so you don't have all this inventory problems and ending up with returns and extra DVDs that you didn't need. So I think that's kind of the future of it. It's a smaller business. Obviously, Netflix shut down DVD by mail, which was kind of the end of an era. But I know there's still fans of it, and I know people still buy laser discs and different things in different formats that they like.
Right, or if you go to thrift stores, you can see people just really clamoring to get to the either VHS or the DVDs.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think it's more nostalgia than anything. I don't think it's a quality issue. I know people that like vinyl records think they sound better than the digital masters, but I think with Blu-ray and I think it's just the having it, knowing you can own it and you can watch it anytime you want for the rest of your life. For a lot of the collectors is what's interesting, to them. And plus you get a lot of behind the scenes, on some of the Blu-rays that people like, and that's an added value for them.
Right, and if maybe there's a little insert that, just like with records, there'd be a cool insert that they would put, and there's just something, if you're a fan of something special about it, but I see what you're saying, yeah. What is working today in the indie landscape?
It's a tough business right now. Like there've been a lot of changes, a lot of strategies, a lot of pullbacks in terms of buying from the streamers. So the things that are working right now are indie films with names, with name casts and commercial genres that are well made and made for a price. So it's more important than ever to have a cast that's recognizable and that works for the individual streaming platforms that are going to buy it. And the bigger names, the better, according to the buyers.
What was it like 10 years ago as compared to now?
It's interesting. I mean, it was more free spending, because the streamers were trying to compete, and Netflix was, really spending to get in the game and to capture market share and to make their mark. So, in 2015 or around that bout when I was at Netflix, I mean, it was a culture of spend now. We're not worried about making profits. We're capturing market share. We're competing. We're building our brand, and we're establishing ourselves. And so they were willing to overpay talent. They were willing to overpay for movies to compete and to drive viewers to their platform. And fortunately, it worked for them. And unfortunately, a lot of the other streamers that launched and tried to compete with them, quickly ran up so much debt they had to change their strategies, and so that led to this pullback that we're seeing now, and a lot of other factors between COVID and strikes and everything else have kind of changed the business a little bit. Like the local productions internationally have become a bigger part of the strategy for these streamers as well. So that's made less slots for indie films, for local U.S. produced indie films. So there have been a lot of changes in the last 10 years. It's just harder. They're not buying as much. And, so you have to be smarter. They're more selective. And what might have, been a slam dunk 10 years ago might not be now. They're going to look at everything very carefully and be very selective.
And do you think it'll ever come back, just as if when there was sort of the A&R of the record industry and all that kind of went away? Is just something from yesteryear that will never come back?
I think it will evolve. I think it's going to be interesting to see, because I think what I'm seeing a lot now, and Tubi's a part of this, is the micro budget features where people are making films for $25,000 and less that are doing well on Tubi, where the production value isn't as big a factor as the story and just what people want to watch. So I think the bar's lower there because people don't have to pay, they're not paying a subscription, so they're okay like watching something. And you've got a lot of other factors with, kind of the YouTube generation, growing every year and pushing the older viewers, out of the picture a little bit. So they're more used to, I think, lower budget, TikTok videos and YouTube videos. And so I think the micro budget kind of trend will continue. To draw viewers, and will change the way things work. And then when you bring in AI, I think you're adding a whole other, kind of creative explosion that you're going to see with people making movies. And so I think that, Netflix will still be there for the $100 million and the $200 million movies, and there'll still be a place for them. But I think where a lot of the excitement and the movement and where the most creative, filmmaking is going to happen is going to be on the kind of really low budget side.
Are you watching TikTok videos?
I watch some, yeah. I mean, I like scrolling. It's a fun pastime, and I try to keep up with trends and see what other people are watching. And so far, the experiments of kind of combining the TikTokers with the traditional film projects haven't really panned out in terms of drawing that audience over. But I think people, really smart people are working on that, and they're going to figure out a way to do that at some point, because YouTube's such a powerful force, and that audience is not watching traditional linear TV, so they're going to have to find a way to appeal to them and get them over. So it's going to be interesting to watch it evolve.
Thank you for watching the video all the way to the end. Here is a complimentary question from our book Story Questions.